In that split second when the bullet tore through the air, everything seemed to freeze. A simple single father, a man who had only ever worried about putting food on the table and caring for his little girl, suddenly threw himself between danger and a child the entire city knew. The only son of one of the most powerful billionaires in America. His blood spilled onto the concrete while the trembling boy's eyes filled with trust and wonder. The billionaire mother, who had always been protected in her world of luxury and cold calculation, stood in shock as she realized that a complete stranger had been willing to trade his life for her child's safety. That gunshot didn't just change the fate of a scared little boy, it opened a journey neither of them could have imagined, where love, trust, and sacrifice would intertwine to lead them to an ending no one saw coming. A warm wedding between a working-class father and a woman who owned half the city. Jack Morrison had never imagined his life would amount to much more than the daily grind. At 34, his hands bore the permanent stains of motor oil and honest work, his back ached from years of crawling under cars at Henderson's auto shop, and his heart carried the weight of raising 8-year-old Emma alone since his wife Sarah had lost her battle with cancer 3 years earlier. Their small apartment on Maple Street wasn't much to look at, but it was home. Emma's drawings covered the walls like colorful bandages over the cracks, her laughter the only music that mattered in Jack's world. Every morning at 5:30, Jack would wake to his ancient alarm clock, shower quickly, and peek into Emma's room where she slept surrounded by stuffed animals and library books. He'd leave a note on her nightstand, sometimes a joke, sometimes a reminder about homework, always ending with "Love you, kiddo." Mrs. Patterson from next door would arrive at 7 to walk Emma to school, a kindness Jack could barely afford to repay. The auto shop consumed his days. Jack had good hands for fixing things, patient hands that could coax life back into dying engines. Gentle hands that Emma trusted to braid her hair every Sunday morning. At month's end, the bills still came faster than the paychecks. He'd sit at their small kitchen table, after Emma went to sleep, calculator in hand, moving numbers around like puzzle pieces that never quite fit. Meanwhile, across town in a world that might as well have existed on another planet, Victoria Blackstone commanded an empire from the 42nd floor of the Blackstone Tower. At 38, she had built her inherited wealth into something extraordinary: technology companies, real estate developments, pharmaceutical investments spanning 3 continents. Her corner office offered a view of the entire city, but she rarely had time to look. Victoria's days began at 4:30 with a workout in her private gym, followed by strategy meetings that started before most people had their first cup of coffee. She moved through board meetings like a conductor leading an orchestra, every gesture deliberate, every word calculated. Her assistants spoke to her in codes of efficiency. The Shanghai deal needs approval, the senator's office called twice. Your son's school sent a reminder about the science fair. 10-year-old Ethan lived in the penthouse floor of their downtown mansion, cared for by a rotation of nannies and tutors who provided excellent education but little warmth. He was a quiet boy with his mother's sharp intelligence, and his late father's gentle eyes that often seemed to be searching for something just out of reach. Victoria loved him fiercely. But love expressed through trust funds and private schools felt cold even to her. Their conversations happened in passing, usually while Victoria was heading to another meeting or another flight. "How was school?" she'd ask, already reading emails on her phone. "Fine," Ethan would answer, already learning that his mother's attention was rationed out in small doses between much larger concerns. The loneliness in both households was a living thing, quiet, persistent, and largely unacknowledged. Jack filled his evenings with Emma's homework and television shows they watched together on their worn couch. But sometimes he'd catch himself staring out their window, wondering if this was all there was. Victoria filled her nights with conference calls to Tokyo and Sydney. But sometimes she'd walk past Ethan's bedroom and hear him talking to his action figures, giving them the conversations he couldn't have with her. Neither of them knew that fate was already setting the stage for their collision. The Thompson Foundation's annual Children's Health Initiative was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in Riverside Park, the kind of family-friendly public event that drew thousands of people, including single fathers looking for free entertainment and billionaire mothers fulfilling social obligations. Jack had promised Emma they'd go to the festival after he finished Mrs. Chen's carburetor repair. Emma had been talking about the face painting and pony rides for weeks, and Jack had been saving his tips to buy her a balloon, and maybe one of those overpriced hot dogs that would make her smile. Victoria was scheduled to give a speech about childhood nutrition initiatives, one of those carefully crafted appearances her publicist insisted were crucial for maintaining her company's positive image. Ethan would stand beside her on the platform, dressed in his best suit, smiling politely while photographers captured images of the caring mother and her well-mannered son. The festival sprawled across the park's 15 acres like a small city built for joy. Families spread blankets under oak trees, children ran between booths selling cotton candy and handmade toys, and the air filled with laughter and music from a local band. Jack held Emma's hand as they wandered through the crowd, her eyes wide with wonder at the face painters transforming children into tigers and princesses. "Can I get my face painted like a butterfly, Daddy?" Emma asked, tugging on Jack's sleeve. "Of course, kiddo," Jack said, reaching for the crumpled $20 bill in his pocket money that should have gone toward groceries but would buy his daughter's happiness instead. 3 booths away, Victoria stood behind the main stage with her speech cards and practiced smile, checking her watch and waiting for her introduction. Ethan fidgeted beside her in his navy blue blazer, more interested in the children playing games than the adults discussing quarterly profits. "Remember to smile when we walk out there," Victoria whispered to her son, straightening his tie. "The photographers will be watching." "I know, Mom," Ethan replied, but his attention had wandered to a group of kids his age, laughing as they tried to knock down milk bottles with beanbags. The trouble started small, the way trouble always does. Marcus Webb had been planning this for months, ever since Victoria's pharmaceutical company had acquired his family's business for a fraction of what it was worth, ever since his father had died of a heart attack, brought on by the stress of losing everything. Marcus wasn't thinking clearly. Grief and rage had tangled his thoughts into knots that made violence seem like the only solution. He'd studied the festival layout, knew where Victoria would be standing, knew the security patterns. Marcus had no military training, no experience with the pistol he'd bought from a pawn shop 3 counties over, but he had desperation and nothing left to lose. The shot came without warning, just as Victoria was walking toward the microphone. The bullet left Marcus's gun with enough force to kill, aimed with enough hatred to end everything Victoria had built. But bullets don't care about intentions or justice or the elaborate plans that desperate men make in their darkest moments. Jack had been watching Emma get her butterfly painted when he heard the first screams, saw people starting to run. His eyes found the source of chaos, a man with a gun pointed toward the main stage. Jack's first instinct was to grab Emma and run, but then he saw him. A boy in a navy blazer, standing frozen on the stage like a deer caught in headlights, too scared to move while adults scattered around him. The gunman was aiming, fingers squeezing the trigger, and in that crystalline moment Jack realized that no one else was close enough, no one else could reach the child in time. Emma was safe behind the face-painting table. The boy on the stage was not. Jack Morrison, who had never considered himself a hero, ran toward danger instead of away from it. His work boots pounded against the grass, his lungs burned, and his mind held only one thought: get there, get there, get there. The bullet meant for Victoria's heart found Jack's shoulder instead as he tackled Ethan to the platform, his body creating a shield between the boy and the violence. The pain was immediate and shocking, but Jack felt something stronger than the agony relief that the child beneath him was breathing, was safe, was alive. "You're safe, kid," Jack whispered to Ethan as blood soaked through his shirt and sirens wailed in the distance. "You're safe." Ethan looked up into the face of the man who had just saved his life, saw kindness there instead of the cool efficiency he'd grown used to, and something inside the 10-year-old boy shifted forever. This stranger had been willing to die for him. Victoria arrived at Jack's side just as the paramedics were loading him onto a stretcher, her composure finally cracking as she saw the blood, saw her son clinging to the hand of a man she'd never met. Jack was conscious but fading, his face pale from blood loss, but he managed to look at her and nod toward Ethan. "He's okay," Jack said, his voice weak but steady. "Just scared. He's okay." Those were the last words Jack Morrison spoke before the ambulance doors closed and he disappeared into the controlled chaos of emergency medicine, leaving behind a billionaire mother who suddenly understood that money couldn't buy the one thing that mattered most: someone willing to die for her child. The story exploded across every news channel within hours. "Local hero saves billionaire's son" ran on the evening broadcast, accompanied by footage of Jack being loaded into the ambulance and Victoria holding Ethan close, while tears ran down her face the first time the public had ever seen her cry. Jack survived the surgery, but barely. The bullet had nicked an artery and collapsed his lung, requiring 3 operations and a week in intensive care. Emma spent those days in a strange suspension of fear and pride, staying with Mrs. Patterson while reporters called asking for interviews and strangers left flowers at their door. Victoria came to the hospital every day, sometimes with Ethan, sometimes alone, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs outside Jack's room, and trying to understand how a man she'd never met had been willing to give everything for her son. She'd built her fortune by reading people, by understanding their motivations, but Jack Morrison didn't fit any equation she knew. When Jack finally woke up, groggy from medication, the first face he saw was Ethan's. The boy had been sitting beside his bed for 2 hours, reading aloud from a Hardy Boys mystery. "You came back," Ethan said when Jack focused on him, and there was such relief in the child's voice that Jack felt his chest tighten. "Told you that you were safe," Jack replied, his voice hoarse. I keep my promises. Victoria watched this exchange from the doorway, seeing something in her son's face that she hadn't witnessed in years: genuine happiness, uncomplicated by expectations or performance. Ethan was talking to Jack the way children talk to beloved uncles or favorite teachers, with trust and affection that couldn't be manufactured or purchased. I need to thank you, Victoria said, finally entering the room and taking the chair on the other side of Jack's bed. She looked different without her business suits and perfect makeup, more vulnerable somehow. No need, Jack said. Any parent would have done the same thing. But Victoria knew that wasn't true. She'd seen how people scattered when the shooting started, how even her security team had been too far away. Jack had run toward danger when everyone else ran away from it. I'd like to help with your medical bills, Victoria said. And Emma's education. Anything else you might need. Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying this woman who commanded boardrooms but seemed uncertain how to navigate a simple conversation about gratitude. He could see Ethan watching their interaction with the intensity of a child who desperately wanted the adults in his life to like each other. I'd appreciate help with the hospital bills, Jack said finally. But Emma and we do fine on our own. Victoria found herself thinking about him at odd moments over the following weeks. During board meetings, she'd remember the calm way he'd spoken to Ethan in the hospital, how he'd made the scared boy laugh with stories about fixing cars and fishing with Emma. The feeling was unfamiliar and unsettling. Ethan was experiencing his own transformation. He'd started asking his mother if they could visit Jack and Emma, if they could go to normal places like parks and ice cream shops instead of charity galas. He talked constantly about his new friend Emma, who seemed to know everything about catching fireflies and building pillow forts. Can Jack teach me to fish? Ethan asked one evening as Victoria was tucking him into bed. Victoria paused, the idea of her son spending time by the river with a man who earned his living with his hands feeling foreign and somehow dangerous. But Ethan's face lit up with such genuine excitement that Victoria found herself calling Jack the next morning, awkwardly asking if he might be willing to take both children fishing some weekend. That first fishing trip changed everything, though none of them realized it at the time. Jack picked them up in his old truck, which had seen better decades, and smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee. Ethan had never been in a vehicle that wasn't spotlessly clean, never sat on seats patched with duct tape or rolled down windows manually. But instead of being dismayed, he seemed delighted. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, wearing jeans for the first time in months, and feeling oddly nervous about spending a day away from phones and meetings. Jack drove with easy confidence through neighborhoods she'd never seen, past small houses with gardens and children playing in yards. The fishing spot was a quiet bend in Miller's Creek, shaded by willow trees, and far from main roads. Jack helped both children bait their hooks with earthworms, showing them how to cast their lines, and where to look for signs of fish beneath the surface. The trick is to be patient, Jack explained to Ethan, who was vibrating with excitement and trying to check his line every 30 seconds. Fish can sense when you're anxious. You have to be calm, like you have all the time in the world. Victoria watched her son absorb this lesson, saw him force himself to sit still and breathe deeply, and wait for something he couldn't control. It occurred to her that Ethan had never been taught patience before. His world was one of immediate gratification, of needs met before they were fully expressed. Emma caught the first fish, a small bass that fought valiantly before Jack helped her reel it in. She insisted they take a picture before releasing the fish back into the creek. Why don't we keep it? Ethan asked, confused. Because it has a family, Emma explained with 8-year-old wisdom. And they're probably worried about where it went. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, as she watched Ethan consider this explanation, saw him nod seriously and say, we should definitely put it back then. Jack made sandwiches for lunch, peanut butter, and jelly cut into triangles, and wrapped in wax paper, the kind of meal Victoria usually considered beneath notice, but that tasted better somehow when eaten sitting on a blanket by the water. They talked about small things. What kind of birds were singing in the trees, whether clouds looked like animals, why some rocks were smooth and others rough. It was the longest conversation Victoria had ever had with her son that wasn't about his schedule or grades. Ethan was funny, she realized. He had opinions about things that didn't matter to anyone's bottom line. He made jokes that actually made her laugh, real, surprised laughter that came from somewhere deeper than social obligation. And Jack was nothing like the men in Victoria's world. He didn't try to impress her with stories of his accomplishments. He didn't calculate the value of every interaction. He was simply present, fully engaged with two children who were having the time of their lives, catching small fish and eating ordinary sandwiches. When Ethan finally caught a fish of his own, a tiny sunfish, he whooped with joy, and immediately looked to Jack for approval. The expression on Jack's face was one of pure pride. That's a beauty, Jack said, and meant it. Your first fish is always special. You'll remember this one forever. Victoria realized she was witnessing something she'd never provided for her son. Someone who celebrated his small victories with genuine enthusiasm, who found joy in his happiness without calculating its usefulness. As the afternoon wound down, Victoria found herself reluctant to return to her world of steel and glass and carefully orchestrated interactions. She'd spent 6 hours thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the clouds meant rain, and it had been the most peaceful 6 hours she'd experienced in years. But peace, Victoria was about to learn, was a fragile thing. The board meeting on Monday morning started normally enough, but as Victoria settled into her role as CEO, Margaret Sinclair cleared her throat with the particular sound that meant trouble. Margaret had been on the board for 15 years, representing old money investors who preferred their business relationships to follow traditional patterns. She was in her 70s, elegant and sharp, with the kind of polite ruthlessness that could destroy careers while discussing the weather. Victoria, Margaret said, her voice carrying the tone of a concerned aunt delivering unwelcome news, we need to discuss your recent associations. Victoria felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with corporate warfare, but this felt different, more personal than the usual battles over strategic direction. I'm not sure what you mean, Victoria said, though she suspected exactly what Margaret meant. The mechanic, Margaret clarified, as if the word itself was distasteful. The man you've been seen with. Taking your son fishing, having dinner at family restaurants. People are talking, Victoria. Our investors are concerned about your judgment. Victoria kept her voice level. Jack Morrison is a friend. He saved Ethan's life. I hardly think spending time with him reflects poor judgment. It reflects poor understanding of optics, Margaret replied smoothly. You're the face of this company, Victoria. Your personal choices affect shareholder confidence. Dating beneath your station. We're not dating, Victoria interrupted. Though even as she said it, she realized the protest sounded hollow. What were they doing, if not dating? Then what would you call it? Margaret asked. And Victoria could hear the trap closing. Because from the outside, it looks like the CEO of Blackstone Industries is having an inappropriate relationship with a working-class man. Our clients expect a certain level of discretion from their business partners. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Victoria could continue her friendship with Jack, but only if she hid it, only if she treated it like something shameful. The alternative was clear. End the relationship or face consequences that could affect her company. I'll take your concerns under advisement, Victoria said, which was corporate speak for go to hell delivered with perfect politeness. But Margaret wasn't finished. There's also the matter of your son. Ethan is the heir to a considerable fortune. This man's daughter attends public school. Lives in a working-class neighborhood. Is this really the environment you want shaping your son's character? Victoria felt something cold and sharp pierce her chest. Attacking her was one thing, but bringing Emma into it, suggesting that an 8-year-old girl who had shown her son genuine friendship was somehow a negative influence. This conversation is over, Victoria said, standing with the kind of authority that usually ended discussions immediately. But as she left the boardroom, Victoria knew the conversation was far from over. Margaret and the others would keep pushing, would find ways to make her personal life a liability. They would force her to choose between the world she'd built and the people who were teaching her what happiness felt like. That evening, Victoria sat in her penthouse office, looking out at city lights while she tried to make sense of the knots in her chest. She'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let personal feelings threaten everything she'd accomplished. But the thought of explaining to Ethan that he couldn't see Emma anymore, couldn't spend weekends learning to fish and be a normal child, the thought of never seeing Jack smile again, never hearing him talk about his simple, honest work, never feeling the peace that settled over her when they sat together watching their children play. Victoria Blackstone was not accustomed to situations she couldn't solve with money or influence or strategic thinking. But matters of the heart followed different rules entirely. Jack knew something was wrong before Victoria said a word. He'd gotten good at reading people during his years as a mechanic, customers worried about money, coworkers having trouble at home, Emma when she was scared about something at school. Victoria had the same tense energy when she arrived at his apartment Saturday morning, the same careful control that meant someone was trying not to fall apart. We need to talk, she said, and Jack felt his stomach drop because those words never led anywhere good. Emma and Ethan were building a complicated structure out of cardboard boxes in the living room, too absorbed in their engineering project to pay attention to adult conversations. Jack led Victoria to the small kitchen, where she stood with her arms crossed like she was trying to hold herself together. The board thinks I'm making a mistake, Victoria said without preamble. They think spending time with you is bad for business. Bad for Ethan's future. Jack leaned against the counter and studied her face, seeing the conflict their duty warring with something softer. And what do you think? I think. Victoria started, then stopped, then tried again. I think they might be right. Our worlds are too different, Jack. The pressure, the expectations, the way people watch everything I do. I can't ask you to live under that scrutiny. And I can't risk everything I've built for. For what? Jack asked quietly. For a mechanic who's not good enough for you. That's not what I meant, Victoria said quickly, but her hesitation told a different story. Jack nodded slowly, understanding more than she was saying. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had known from the first day they went fishing that they were living in a bubble that couldn't last forever. People like Victoria Blackstone didn't end up with people like Jack Morrison, not in real life, not when cameras were watching and money was involved. I get it, Jack said, his voice steady, even though something was breaking inside his chest. I've always known we were from different worlds. I just thought maybe that didn't matter as much as I'd been told it did. Victoria looked like she was in physical pain. It's not about what I want, Jack. It's about what's realistic. What's fair to you, to Emma, to Ethan. The media attention alone would be overwhelming, and if my business suffers, thousands of people lose their jobs. I have responsibilities. You have a choice, Jack said, not angrily but firmly. You can choose to let other people decide what your life should look like, or you can choose to live it yourself. But don't pretend this is about what's fair to me. This is about what's safe for you. The accusation stung because it was partially true. Victoria had built her success on calculated risks and strategic decisions. What she felt for Jack, what she felt when they were together, when Ethan laughed at his jokes, when Emma showed her how to braid friendship bracelets wasn't safe or strategic or easily quantified. Maybe you're right, Victoria said quietly. Maybe I am choosing safety over this. But I have to think about Ethan's future, about the company, about all the people depending on me to make smart decisions. And what about depending on yourself to make happy ones? Jack asked. Victoria didn't have an answer, because she'd spent so many years measuring success by external metrics that she'd forgotten how to calculate the value of her own happiness. But the conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both adults freeze. Emma screaming. They ran to the living room to find the cardboard fort collapsed, Emma trapped beneath a large piece that had been meant to serve as a roof, and Ethan trying frantically to lift it off her. Jack and Victoria worked together to free Emma, who emerged with a scraped elbow and tears of frustration rather than pain. I'm okay, Emma said quickly, seeing the panic on the adults' faces. It just scared me. The fort was supposed to be stronger than that. But as Jack was examining Emma's scrape, and Victoria was checking Ethan for injuries, none of them noticed the man watching from across the street. The man who had been following Victoria's movements for weeks, waiting for the right moment to finish what Marcus Webb had started. David Chen had lost his job when Blackstone Industries acquired his company and streamlined operations, eliminating what they called redundant positions. Unlike Marcus Webb, David was patient, methodical, willing to wait for the perfect opportunity to make Victoria Blackstone pay for the lives she'd destroyed in the name of efficiency and profit margins. And there she was. Distracted by domestic concerns, vulnerable in a way she never was in her fortress downtown. David adjusted his grip on the knife hidden in his jacket and began walking toward the apartment building where the woman who had ruined his life was playing house. Jack was helping Emma wash the scrape when he saw the man's reflection in the bathroom. Mirrors saw him standing in the living room doorway, with something metallic in his hand, and an expression that Jack recognized from his worst nightmares. Time slowed again, just like during the shooting, and Jack's mind cataloged the geography of danger. Emma behind him, Ethan and Victoria in the living room, and a man with a weapon between them and safety. Emma, stay in the bathroom and lock the door, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying calm authority that made his daughter obey without question. Jack stepped into the living room just as David was raising the knife, just as Victoria was turning toward the sound of movement. Ethan saw the blade first and screamed. And Victoria spun around to face the man who had come to end her life. You destroyed my family, David said, his voice shaking with rage and grief. You took everything from me, and now I'm going to take everything from you. Victoria stepped protectively in front of Ethan, but Jack was already moving, already throwing himself between the knife and the people he loved, because that's what they were. He realized in that crystal-clear moment, they were his family now regardless of what the board of directors thought. The knife caught Jack in the side, sliding between ribs with intimate violence. But Jack's momentum carried him forward, tackling David to the ground while Victoria grabbed both children and pushed them toward the kitchen, toward the back door, toward whatever safety she could create. Jack and David fought on the living room floor, blood making everything slippery while they struggled for control of the weapon. Jack was stronger, but David had the advantage of desperation, and the knife changed hands twice before Jack managed to pin David's wrist to the floor. Victoria was already on the phone with 911, her voice steady despite the chaos as she gave their address and requested immediate assistance. Jack could hear sirens in the distance, could feel his strength ebbing as blood soaked through his shirt, but David was secured and the children were safe, and that was what mattered. "You're going to be okay," Victoria said, kneeling beside Jack as the police took David into custody, and paramedics worked to stop the bleeding. "You're going to be fine." Jack looked up at her face, saw tears streaming down her cheeks, saw love there that she wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Victoria," he said, his voice weak but urgent, "this is who I am. I can't stop protecting the people I care about, even when it's dangerous. Even when it's not smart. If that's not what you want." "It's exactly what I want," Victoria said, her voice fierce with certainty. "It's everything I want." And in that moment, with Jack bleeding on her living room floor and police cars filling the street outside, Victoria Blackstone made the easiest decision of her life. She chose love over safety, chose happiness over strategy, chose a future that couldn't be calculated or controlled but could be lived with authenticity she'd forgotten was possible. The second attack made national news in ways the first hadn't. Billionaire's boyfriend stabbed protecting her family ran across cable news for 3 days straight, accompanied by footage of Jack being loaded into an ambulance and Victoria holding Emma's hand, while Ethan pressed close to her other side. Margaret Sinclair called an emergency board meeting for Tuesday morning, while Jack was still recovering from surgery. Victoria attended via video conference from the hospital, where she'd spent every moment since Jack had been admitted. "This has gone too far," Margaret said without preamble. "The publicity is a nightmare, the security concerns unprecedented, and our stock price has dropped 12% since Friday. This relationship is no longer a personal matter, it's a business crisis." Victoria looked at the faces of the 12 men and women who had helped her build an empire. They were scared, she realized. Scared of the unpredictability that came with human emotions, scared of a CEO who might make decisions based on love rather than logic. "You're right," Victoria said calmly. "This relationship has become a business matter. So let me make this simple for everyone. Jack Morrison and his daughter Emma are going to be permanent parts of my life and Ethan's life. If you can't accept that, if you think personal happiness makes someone unfit to lead this company, then you're welcome to find a new CEO." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Victoria had just offered her resignation rather than end her relationship with a mechanic from the wrong side of town, had chosen love over a billion-dollar empire. "Victoria," Margaret said carefully, "you're not thinking clearly. The stress of recent events has shown me exactly what matters," Victoria interrupted. "I've spent 15 years building this company, but I've spent the last 3 months learning what it means to be happy. What it means to have a family held together by more than legal documents and financial obligations. Jack Morrison has saved my son's life twice, has shown him what it means to be a good man. Has given both of us more joy than all the money in my accounts. And you want me to give that up for stock prices? What are you proposing?" asked Robert Hayes, the board's vice chairman. "I'm proposing that we trust our shareholders to care more about profits than gossip," Victoria said. "Our company's fundamentals are strong, our growth trajectory solid, and our quarterly results speak for themselves. If investors want to sell stock because I'm dating someone who doesn't own a yacht, they're welcome to do so. But I suspect most of them care more about returns than personal drama." It was a calculated risk, but Victoria had built her fortune on calculated risks. The difference was that this time she wasn't risking money or market position, she was risking everything for the chance to build a life that made her excited to wake up each morning. The board voted to support her decision, not because they understood her choice but because they understood business. Victoria Blackstone was irreplaceable, and irreplaceable CEOs got to make their own rules about personal relationships. But the real victory happened later that evening, when Victoria returned to Jack's hospital room to find him awake and alert. Sitting up in bed, while Emma read to him from a book about dragons and Ethan worked on homework at the small table by the window. "How did the board meeting go?" Jack asked, though Victoria's expression had already told him everything he needed to know. "I told them that some things are worth more than money," Victoria said, taking the chair beside his bed that she'd come to think of as hers. "And that if they couldn't understand that, they could find themselves a new CEO." Jack reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. And they decided that love makes better headlines than corporate reshuffling," Victoria said, smiling for the first time in days. Emma looked up from her book, her face serious with 8-year-old concerns. "Does this mean you and Ethan can still be our family?" Victoria felt her chest tighten with emotions that had no names, felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this little girl who had somehow become as important to her as her own son, who had shown her that family could be chosen as well as inherited. "If you'll have us," Victoria said, "I'd like that very much." Emma grinned and went back to her dragon story. Ethan looked up from his math homework, pencil poised over fraction problems that suddenly seemed much less important. "So we're really going to be a family?" he asked. "We already are," Jack said, squeezing Victoria's hand while he smiled at both children. "We just made it official." 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in spring when the cherry trees were blooming and the air smelled like new beginnings, Jack Morrison and Victoria Blackstone were married in Riverside Park, 50 yards from the spot where a bullet had changed all their lives. The ceremony was small by billionaire standards, large by mechanic standards, and perfect by the standards of people who had learned that the best things in life couldn't be purchased or planned or predicted. Victoria wore a simple white dress that she'd chosen because Emma had said it made her look like a princess, and Jack wore his best suit with a tie that Ethan had picked out because it had tiny fish on it. Emma was the flower girl, scattering petals with serious concentration, while Ethan served as ring bearer, carrying the simple bands they'd chosen together at a jewelry store downtown where the owner knew Jack's name and treated Victoria like any other customer. The guest list included Mrs. Patterson and Jack's co-workers from the auto shop, Victoria's assistant and a few board members who had genuinely become friends, children from Emma's class and Ethan's tutoring group, and Marcus Webb's widow, who had asked to attend because she wanted to see something beautiful grow from the violence that had scarred all their lives. The officiant was Judge Patricia Williams, who had handled Emma's custody paperwork after Sarah's death and had agreed to perform the ceremony because she'd never seen Jack look as happy as he had in recent months. She kept the formal parts brief and focused on the promises Jack and Victoria were making to each other and to the family they'd created from unlikely circumstances. "Marriage," Judge Williams said as Jack and Victoria faced each other with their children standing beside them, "is not about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own, whose strengths fill in your weaknesses, whose love makes you braver than you ever imagined you could be." Victoria looked into Jack's eyes and saw the man who had saved her son twice, who had taught her what it meant to be present in her own life, who had shown her that vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of all genuine connection. Jack looked back and saw the woman who had chosen love over safety, who had risked everything for the chance to build something real. "Do you, Jack Morrison, take Victoria Blackstone to be your wife, to love, and honor, and cherish through whatever comes next?" "I do," Jack said, and his voice carried all the certainty of a man who had found his home in another person's heart. "Do you, Victoria Blackstone, take Jack Morrison to be your husband, to love and honor and cherish through whatever comes next?" "I do," Victoria said, and for the first time in her adult life, she was making a promise that had nothing to do with profit margins and everything to do with the simple faith that love was worth betting everything on. They exchanged rings as Emma and Ethan beamed beside them, and when Judge Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the applause came from people who had watched two broken families become something whole and beautiful and stronger than either had been alone. The reception was held in the park's pavilion, with catering from the Italian restaurant where Jack had taken Victoria on their first official date and a wedding cake that Emma had helped design, featuring sugar flowers that looked like the ones growing in the community garden where they'd spent Sunday mornings planting vegetables. Jack's first dance with his new wife was to a song about finding home in unexpected places, and as they swayed together while their friends and family watched, Victoria whispered in his ear, "Thank you for saving me." "Thank you for letting me," Jack whispered back, and they both understood that they were talking about more than gunshots and knives. They were talking about the way Jack had saved Victoria from a life that looked successful but felt empty, and the way Victoria had saved Jack from believing that his love wasn't valuable enough to change someone's world. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Emma and Ethan sat at the children's table with their faces sticky from cake, comparing the flowers they'd caught during the bouquet toss and planning the fort they wanted to build in the backyard of the house that would now belong to all four of them. "Are you glad we're going to be brother and sister?" Emma asked. "Yeah," Ethan said without hesitation. "Are you?" "Yeah," Emma said. "I always wanted a brother. And I like your mom. She's learning how to be fun." Victoria, overhearing this conversation, felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. Learning how to be fun, it was perhaps the most accurate description of her recent transformation, and certainly the most important skill she'd acquired in 38 years. Jack appeared at her side, offering his hand for one last dance as the band played their final song. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Morrison?" Victoria took his hand and let him lead her onto the empty dance floor, where they moved slowly together while their children played nearby, and the lights in the trees created a canopy of stars above their heads. "I like the sound of that," she said, resting her head against his shoulder and breathing in the scent that would forever mean safety and love and the promise that someone would always be there to catch her if she fell. "You're safe, kid," Jack murmured against her hair, the same words he'd spoken to Ethan on a day when the world had changed forever. Words that had become their family's unofficial motto. "We all are." And as the last song ended, and they gathered their children and headed toward the truck that would take them home to their new life together, Victoria Blackstone Morrison understood that she had finally learned the difference between being successful and being happy, between building an empire and building a family, between having everything she'd thought she wanted and having everything she'd never known she needed. The bullet that had brought them together had been meant to destroy, but in the end, it had created something beautiful. A love strong enough to bridge any gap, a trust deep enough to weather any storm, and a family bound not by blood or obligation, but by the simple, revolutionary choice to put each other first, always and forever. "You're safe, kid. And so are we."